welcome to another episode of Comicology. I'm your host, Jeff Peters, and this week I got nothing clever to say. Today, as part of our ongoing series of the oral history of comic book artists, we're talking with Walt Simonson. Walt Simonson is currently working on Elric and Hawkgirl for DC Comics, and one of his greatest achievements was his work on Thor and the X Factor. But it's no fun if I sit here and tell you about it. We sent Anna Cody to talk to Walt at the Hawthorne High School Comic Convention. So let's hear what Anna has to say. Anna?
Hello, Jeff. We're back here at Hawthorne High School, and I'm here with Walter Simonson, writer and artist. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, but boy, I don't have your clip pronunciation, so my sound's going to smear together through this whole thing, but I'll do what I can.
You've got that sexy raspy
No, I talk fast is what it is.
It's great. Wow, well, it's such a pleasure for us to talk to you today. Could you, wow, how did you get into the business? I read geology.
I did.
School for geology?
I did. I read comics as a kid, and then when you get into high school, I quit reading them because it's embarrassing to be seen by girls at the spinner racks in the drugstore. Not that I had any social life at all. I don't know what I was thinking. It wouldn't have made any difference. Nobody would have cared. But I quit reading them. It was true. And then, but I was very interested in dinosaurs. So I went to college as a geology major to study dinosaurs. And while I was in college, I discovered Marvel Comics. This was in the mid-'60s. So guys like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and Don Heck and Stan Lee were doing some of the best work of their career. And so I discovered those comics. I began reading them while I was a geology major. And then what happened was, at the end of my senior year, I decided not to go into geology. I decided it's not what I wanted to do. And I really didn't know, I didn't have any other career direction at the time, but I had always drawn. My dad's a scientist. My brother became a scientist.
Really?
So I don't know anybody who's an artist. The idea of a freelance career, it just wasn't anything I knew anything about. But I went to art school then because drawing was the only other thing I had an interest in besides geology, dinosaurs. So in art school, that was in the late 60s, early 70s, I went to the Rhode Island School of Design. And then I ended up...
Great school.
It was a good school. It was a very good school, actually. I had a good time when I was there. I ended up drawing comics as a degree project. And so by the time I graduated, I kind of went back as an undergraduate for a second time. For 3 years. I graduated in '72. And my senior thesis, if you will, was a comic strip that I had written, penciled, inked, and lettered. It was in black and white. And that became my portfolio. It was called The Star Slammers. It was a pulp science fiction story. And that became my portfolio. So in August of '72, I went to New York City with my cardboard portfolio, and I ended up showing it, going to DC Comics. But at the time, they were publishing work that I was really interested in. Went to DC Comics. I, by a complete happenstance, ended up talking to Carmine Infantino, who at the time was DC's head guy. I don't know if he was their editorial director or publisher, whatever his title was. Carmine liked my work a lot, and he saw to it that I got work from DC. And then after I'd been getting a little work from DC, other editors kind of pitched in, and then I got a little here and a little there, and after a while, my career began to develop, and I was able to...
What were you working on? What characters in the early...
In the beginning, I was really doing backup stories of no characters. Now, it's not much like that in mainstream comics anymore, but at the time, the early 70s and before that, a lot of regular comics, all-star westerns and Star-Spangled War stories, all these different things, had backup stories. And so a lot of young guys, you could learn to do your craft badly in the beginning and get paid for it. And so that's where a lot of us did a lot of our work. Me, Howard Chaykin, Jim Starlin, a lot of backup stories that people didn't see very much of. But you got paid for it, you learned how to do your job, and then as time went by, you graduated more to lead features. So what happened to me is I did backup stories for a while. Eventually, Archie Goodwin, who became a very good friend of mine, who was an editor at DC Comics, offered me a backup story. He was editing Detective Comics. He was going to create a new series called Manhunter. It was going to run in the back of Detective Comics. This was maybe after I'd been in comics for, I don't know, 8 or 9, 10 months maybe. And I'd been done some backup work for Archie he had liked. So I began drawing Manhunter. He was writing it. And the book, it was only bi-monthly. It was 8 pages every 2 months in Detective. But it got a lot of notice in professional circles. There wasn't the kind of fandom we have now. The kind of conventions we see here, they just didn't really exist back then. They were just getting started. Right. So there wasn't the kind of fan interest the way, other than really underground. Right. And so we ended up doing the book. It got a lot of notice professionally. It won some professional awards, and really that's what solidified my career. I mean, when I was done that book, a lot of people who were in the professional end of comic books knew who I was, and I was able to I was able to get work. So that was the important part.
Wow. Who were your big influences early on?
Early on, the guys from Marvel, the Jack Kirbys, the Ditkos. I was also while I was in art school, I discovered the work. A friend of mine, Doug Smith, who was became an illustrator, showed me the work of Jim Holdaway. Holdaway was the original artist on a newspaper strip called Modesty Blaze, an English adventure strip written by Peter O'Donnell, created by Peter O'Donnell. Holdaway drew the first 15, 16 episodes. He died young. By the time I found his work, he had just died. Became a huge influence on my stuff. I liked a lot of European work. I was able to find, thanks to Bud Plant, who even then was getting stuff in from other countries, foreign graphic novels. I was a big fan of Mobius, Jean Giraud, the Blueberry stuff. I was a big fan of Jean-Claude Mézières and his Valerian Age of Space-Time. I discovered the work of Palacios in Spain, some early work by Sergio Topi in Italy, and all those guys. I looked at a lot of that stuff, and I was really taken with the storytelling and with the graphic quality of and the beauty of their drawing. And so that stuff had a really big influence on my work. So, and then eventually guys like Otomo and Akira, that was much later, but some of the Japanese, we didn't see as much of that stuff at the time. But I ended up taking a lot from a lot of those people. So my influences were very eclectic.
Yes.
Archie certainly as a writer was a big influence on my stuff. Probably Walt Kelly was an influence because I was a big Pogo fan as a kid. And there was a New Yorker cartoonist named George Price, whose work ran from the 30s to the 80s and 90s maybe. Died some years ago now, but he cartooned for a long time. My parents had a book of George Price's cartoons from the 50s, and that's probably one of the first artists whose name I ever knew. And George Price never drew his eyes on the same level, and I've never been able to do it ever since. I was early influence. My eyes have been screwy ever since. I just can't help it.
Talk about some of your favorite work that led up to Thor.
Well, I've been fortunate enough to be able to do a lot of work that I've enjoyed doing, I've really wanted to do. So I did Metal Men for just a few issues for DC. That was after Manhunter. Manhunter was a very straightforward kind of action adventure strip. Metal Men was kind of a goofy, cartoony, over-the-top sort of thing, very bold drawing. That was fun. I had different writers on that. I did the adaptation, drew the adaptation of the movie Alien. Heavy Metal published it as a graphic novel. Archie wrote the adaptation.
Wow.
That was fun. That was really interesting. Trying to get likenesses is not my strong point, but it was really fun to do that, and the story was really cool. So it was fun to do. We had 61, 62 pages of story. We could really get a lot of it in there. That was fun to do. Somewhere in there, I did some Battlestar Galactica. That was the first work I actually wrote. I got into comics as an artist. With Galactica, I began doing a little of the writing toward the end of the run in that book, and that was my first real writing. When that book ended, Archie, who is now at Marvel, and they published Galactica, he had liked my writing, so he asked if I wanted to write Raiders of the Lost Ark, the adaptation from Marvel. They were doing the comic book of the strip, of the movie rather. So I wrote that, and I did a graphic novel of the Star Slammers. I went back to the Star Slammers, the characters I'd done.
Writing, you were also drawing at the same
No, I was by this time I was Galactica. Galactica I wrote and drew. Raiders of the Lost Ark, John Buscema and Klaus Janson drew, and I wrote it. So I got in to be able to write stuff for other artists, which was cool. Then I did a graphic novel of the Star Slammers, who were my characters from art school, and that came out from Marvel as a graphic novel. And then I was offered Thor by Mark Grunewald, who was the editor of the book at the time, and he asked if I wanted to write and draw. We had talked about Thor some earlier, and he knew that I was a big Thor fan. When I was reading Marvel comics in the mid-60s, they had that's when they only had about 11 or 12 comics a month coming out. So I read all of them. But Thor was my favorite. I like Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four and Iron Man, and I read all the rest of them. I enjoyed them. But Thor was my very favorite. I was a big Norse mythology fan. And so seeing it, in a comic book form was really exciting. So we had talked about Thor a lot. I'd had a bunch of ideas for Thor, and he gave me the chance to do them. So that's really how I got in the book.
That's incredible. And then you took over the book. I mean, you got more and more.
I did. I'd actually drawn it for a year in the 70s, late 77, 78. Len Wein had written it. I had done layouts for it, and Tony DeZuniga had done the finishes. That was 12 issues plus an annual that Roy Thomas wrote. And then in '83, when Mark offered me the chance to do it, he offered me the chance to be both the writer and the artist on the book. So there I really was able to do everything, and and that was fun.
And you seem to take him a different way.
Well,
But it was big operatic stories.
it was. I had ideas. The thing is, I was a big fan of Stan and Jack's Thor, and when they were doing Journey in the Mystery, they had done the run from about issue 115, 114, which is the return. That was the absorbing man entering this picture, and then about 20, 30 issues up to about 139, 140, the Troll God War. Those issues to me that was primo Thor, and so
Primo Thor.
without going back and doing Jack and Stan's Thor, which I couldn't really have done anyway, that was the feeling I was trying to get in the work I did. When Stan and Jack were doing it, they were doing mythological stuff, they were doing science fiction, they mixed in Ego Living Planet, they mixed in Tana, Nile, the colonizers of Rigel, which I thought was very cool because they had the kind of science fiction which looks forward, mixed in with Thor and mythology which kind of looks back. So there's this instant tension kind of between those different directions. I like that. But I like the mythology, the mythological aspects of the script, of the potential for it. And so I tried to draw a lot of that work, the mythological aspects, into the book. I didn't want to do the myths. After all, if you want to read the myths, you can go buy the book in the bookstore and get the real myths. And I wanted, I didn't try and make his hair red. I gave him a beard. That was kind of fun. I was a cheap model, and my beard wasn't all gray then. But I gave him a beard, but I didn't give him red hair. I didn't do other stuff. I didn't change his costume to be more Nordic. I did make Asgard based more on kind of ideas of Norse architecture, which are a little unclear, but it wasn't the Jack Kirby science fiction city. So I changed some of that stuff, and I had a good time with it. I just really tried to. I thought the Norse myths is what made that book different from Superman or Batman or the Fantastic Four or Spider-Man. It's what it brought into the comic that gave it its own identity. And so I tried to bring that stuff into the comic when I was doing it. And that's what made it fun for me.
How is Thor a different kind of hero than, say, Batman?
He wasn't out for revenge the way Batman is. All the characters have their kind of motivations. Batman's kind of classic because his parents are dead. He fights crime in their honor and their memory and in revenge for what happened to them. Thor, coming out of the Norse myths, Thor is really a god of the earth. Odin is kind of the sky father. He's a sky father god. He's the lord of everything, or the head, the chief god. But Thor really had an affinity for earth, for Midgard, and for mortals. And he was kind of their special protector in the Norse myths in a lot of ways. And so I used that kind of as the underpinning for what he was very altruistic in that sense. But he had a connection to the earth, that his mother was an earth goddess. And so I thought that was what gave him a connection to defending mortals and trying to keep stuff on an even keel. When mortals were threatened, he was in there trying to help out. That was kind of his brief as a god.
Now, you've written with your wife, correct? Your wife is also...
Yes, we did write it. She writes comics. I had to think. She edited comics for a while, and then she wrote them, Louise, and Wheezy by nickname. And so Wheezy was an editor originally. She edited the work I did when I was doing Battlestar Galactica. She was my editor when I was a writer and an artist. And then, I forget the order of all this stuff, we did X Factor together where she was the writer and I was the artist. That was for Marvel. And then somewhere in there, we worked as writer together on a project called Meltdown, which was a 4-issue miniseries that Kent Williams and Jay Muth painted with Havoc and Wolverine. And so the two of us worked together as writers, and they worked on the books as the artists. So we've worked in kind of the different combinations. She hasn't drawn one of my comics yet, but I think she's going to refuse to. So I'm hoping I get her to do it, but that hasn't happened yet. So perhaps it won't. But I would like to work with her again. I really have a great deal of respect for her as a writer. I love what she writes.
Yes.
She's very character driven. I'm kind of plot driven with character worked in. She kind of starts with the characters. She created a book called Power Pack that Marvel published. And it was just about these 4 kids, and she wrote children beautifully. Wheezy writes children really well. A lot of people in comics, it's like artists. A lot of artists in comics. This used to be true, maybe not as true anymore. I don't want to cast any aspersions, but drawing kids isn't like drawing adults.
Right.
And you get a lot of kids in comics that are drawn like small adults. So, and that's kind of true in the writing as well. Well, Wheezy wrote children, I thought, really beautifully, and she wrote the Power Pack children really beautifully. And she got a couple of artists, June Brigman and John Bogdanov, who drew kids really well. So when she was doing that work, that was some fine stuff. I don't know if I could really draw children quite that well, but I'd love to work on a book with her again sometime when she was writing. I got to draw it because I like her stories so much.
Now for DC, you worked on Orion?
I did. I'm a big Jack Kirby fan.
Yes.
but I'm really a giant New Gods. Fourth World. Let's do all the fourth, not just the New Gods, the whole Fourth World stuff. I thought Jack did work on that. That's my favorite Jack Kirby work.
Is that right?
It is. I mean, I love Thor, the Fantastic Four.
Yeah.
A lot of Jack stuff I love, in the 60s especially. The earlier work, some of the 50s stuff I know, Challenges of the Unknown. Before that, I'm not really that familiar with it, so I don't have any opinions about that stuff. I mean, Jack was just a Promethean talent. The Fourth World stuff to me is an ambitious project that created something. I've seen nobody else do it. I've said this elsewhere, so maybe people have heard this before from me, but I haven't seen anybody else do this. Maybe somebody has. I don't read all the comics that come out. But what Jack did was tell a big story in 4 bi-monthly comics. And it was a braided storyline, which means that you never got all the story from one comic. And each comic had a different viewpoint on what was happening. And the result was, as you read these as they were being published, you slowly gathered this larger and larger understanding of what was happening. It wasn't just linear, it was really like a quilt. And it was astounding. And now, when people read it now, you never read it that way because they've been reprinted as, all the New Gods issues, all the Forever People, all Jimmy Olsen, all Mr. Miracle.
Yeah.
Well, that isn't, because I read them when they came out. I was just in art school at the time. And when you read them as they came out, you read, I think it was the first 3 Jimmy Olsens, and then the Forever People, and I forget the order, then the New Gods, then Mr. Miracle, then Jimmy Olsen, and then it rotated, it rolled as it went along. So gradually you built up this larger and larger picture.
And you work on your psyche.
And it was great. It was an astounding piece of creative endeavor. And so I've always loved those characters. And a few years ago I had the chance to do my own work on them.
Wow.
I'm not doing 4 bi-monthly issues. I'm not Jack Kirby. So I tried to focus on one aspect of what Jack did, which is the New Gods characters, with some guest appearances from other guys that have been around. But I wasn't really trying to do all those guys in one monthly comic. My favorite character, if you ask people in general, a lot of fans, they'll say, who's your favorite character in the New Gods? A lot of them will say Mr. Miracle, Scott Free. And I think Scott Free is a great character.
Yeah.
But Orion is my favorite guy. Scott Free is a guy you'd like to live next to. He's a sweet guy,
Right.
and Orion is a guy. Orion is a guy you don't want to live next to. He's an angry, crabby, incredible warrior. And I thought about that. Actually, my wife Louise and I talked about this before I began writing my first issue of Orion. And one of the things about that is that Scott Free's kind of dull. I mean, he's a great character, but he's kind of, he's like this guy that's really sweet.
You know what to expect.
You know what to expect. And the thing that doesn't make any sense, in a way, out of that, Jack had a theme of nature versus nurture. It ran through his work in the Fourth World. And part of it is, that's interesting, part of the conundrum, is that Scott Free is the son of High Father. So essentially, he's the son of heaven. He's robbed his birthright. He's traded the dark side. He grows up in hell. And he comes out of it, no birthright, I'm raised in hell, I'm a nice guy. That's what he gets out of it. I'm going, how does that work? And Orion's the son of the devil. He's Darkseid's son. He's raised in heaven. His stepfather is High Father, a really sweet guy. He's this crabby guy. I'm really interested in the idea that Orion, I mean, he's obviously a great warrior because of his blood, because of his heritage from Darkseid, because of the anger from Apocalypse. It's like he's a sort of a single representative of all of this fury that Apocalypse represents. And because of his upbringing by High Father, he's able to channel that essentially for good.
Yes.
Scott Free, nice guy.
Yeah.
And the other thing about these books for me, this came out during the Vietnam War. These books came out at the end of Vietnam, which is my generation.
Yeah.
So for me, what these books are structurally, there's a great war, this great cosmic war of the gods, the good gods and the bad gods. The New Gods is that war seen from the level of the primary warriors. Guys like Orion, Mantis, all the characters that inhabit that book, the Deep Six.
Right.
It's the front lines. The Forever People is that war seen in a way from the point of view of the children of the war.
Right.
The young gods who inhabit the Super Cycle and Roar Around and Mark Megaton and Beautiful Dream and the rest of them.
Right.
And what they are is, for them, war is still an adventure. It's kind of a glorious adventure. It's exciting, it's dangerous, but it doesn't have, there's a line Darkseid has about Orion, that Orion, as Darkseid does, Orion understands that war is the cold game of the butcher. And that's what it's like for those guys. But for the Forever People, It's not like that for them. It's a glorious adventure, but it's still important, it's still exciting, it's still adventurous.
Right.
Mr. Miracle is the conscientious objector. He wants to opt out of this war. He's had it, he understands what it's about, doesn't want to do it, and they kind of keep pulling him back in like the Godfather. So he's involved with it, but it's not what he wants to be doing. And then Jimmy Olsen, it was the war as it affected the ordinary mortal. The trickle-down theory of the war about what happened on Earth, where things got into people's hands, terrible weapons, stuff happened.
Very current ideas.
Yes, it's
ideas.
kind of timeless ideas.
Yeah.
And so that's the sort of that. I mean, I didn't try and capture that structure in Orion because that's really way beyond my ability to do in one comic book. But I had that in the back of my mind. That's what I think of when I'm doing New Gods work.
Got it.
And that's kind of where I try to take. I try to focus on Orion as one character and sort out what I thought about him. Essentially, the 25 issues I did were his basically his temptation and his fall and his redemption. And at the very end, the final issue, I got to address the idea of Scott Free and why Scott Free is the nice guy he is after his upbringing. And I was able to do something with that I was very pleased about.
You are known for your incredibly well-designed pages, and particularly your splash pages. And could you just describe for the layman out there, like what a splash page is?
Well, the splash page in general, usually it's the first page of a comic, and usually it's a single big image.
Yeah.
Title of the story across, the name of the comic, the indicia, the little legal baloney below it. Well, it used to be. But it was one big image. You'd open it up, you go, wow, that's kind of cool, and you'd read the comic. And the idea is it's to bring you, as with the cover, it's to bring you into the story and start making you want to read the comic book. And presumably pay a few bucks or in the old days a dime, now a few bucks.
Right.
So the idea is it's really your introduction into the story. Occasionally I'll put it on page 2 or page 3, but really it's the opening. In my case, one of the things that I just do as an artist, I'm interested in shape. So the design work that I do is a lot about the shape on a page. The other thing I'm interested in is there were a series of illustrators, starting with Howard Pyle in the late 1800s in America, and then a lot of students. He had a school called the Brandywine School, and the Wyeth, N.C. Wyeth was his student, Frank Schoonover. There were a number of guys. They really were an American tradition in illustration for many years into the 30s and 40s, and there are still guys that go back to those guys as well. And one of the things about their work that I really love is that it's generally meticulously researched, but also it's very bold in the way the paint, I'm not talking about, is laid down on the canvas. I'm not a painter, but you can see it on the canvas. And the neat thing about that is when you look at one of their pictures, like N.C. Wyeth's Treasure Island, the great children's books he illustrated, what you see is, you see two things at once. You see the picture, the 3 dimensions, like 3D kids. You see the 3-dimension going into the picture plane, back into the drawing, into the painting, the lifeboats or the pirates or the mountains or whatever it is he's drawing, the clouds. But the paint's so thick, you're aware of the surface of the drawing as well. So you have this double image of the flat picture plane and the depth of the picture. I love that. I couldn't tell you why. I just love the idea that you see the picture plane and the picture at the same time.
Now, how can you do that in comic books?
Well, because you make pictures. My work is very graphic. Eric's going down into a deep canyon, and so I've tried to show the depth and the scale by doing large panels, by doing a very small figure as he's walking down. There's a very tiny figure here as he's walking down into the canyon, and at the same time, I've tried to have a lot of shapes, these great big shapes of black, the textures, the open shapes, the negative space, the open space, and play those off against each other because it reminds you of the picture plane. At the same time, you're looking down into the abyss in the drawing.
Wow.
So this is how I try to translate that into black and white. Whether it's successful or not, that's a different question. But that's what interests me in drawing, and for me, it's part of what gives life to the drawing. That kind of interplay of 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional space makes the drawing alive, and that's really what I'm trying to do with the pictures I draw. I think that gives the comics life. It gives the story life itself. It lends life to the story you're telling, and keeps the drawing, hopefully, keeps the drawing fresh after you've been drawing for many, many years. You want to keep it as fresh as possible.
Incredible. Do you have any ideas for industry growth and acceptance?
I think, well, I kind of like the subversive nature. I go back to when comics were subversive. That's one of the first things kids could buy, and their parents wouldn't maybe know about it. But we don't have so many kid readers anymore. The main thing I would think now is that I really like the idea that comics are expanding in the bookstores, that they're getting out to a broader audience, that they're available to a broader audience. I mean, And for a number of years, comics have really been sold pretty much only in comic shops.
That's right.
Not really much in mom and pop stores anymore, maybe a few spinner racks here and there, but not a lot, at least not that I've seen.
Right.
And so I think that, you know, it's like any product you've got, it has to get out where people can find it.
Got it.
If they can't find it, they ain't buying it.
Got it.
And so my feeling is I'm delighted with that. I hope we can really push that and do a lot more of it.
Finally, what's new? What's up and coming for you?
This page you saw was from a book called Elric, The Making of a Sorcerer. Michael Moorcock's a fantastic fantasy writer, very well known. I won't even go into that, we're out of time. But we're doing a project together. A lot of his Elric books have been adapted to comic book form. Craig Russell's the best known artist on those. Other guys have done them as well, Frank Brenner, other artists as well. And Mike has written a story for comics that I'm getting to draw. Basically, it's kind of like an early Elric before he gets all the stuff that makes him the doom-haunted character he becomes. It's when he starts to get that stuff.
That's amazing.
And so then I read this stuff in college, so I get to draw Elric the first time he gets Stormbringer, and I'm psyched. I'm just psyched. So that's what I'm working on right now. When that's done, I'm doing a solo book for DC. I've already written all those characters. I've written all the stories. I'm going to be doing a Wildcat story for DC. That's right, Wildcat, one of their old characters in the 40s,
right.
A one-off, and then a short series for Wildstorm. So I've got about a year's worth of work. If I live long enough to finish Elric, then I'll have a series of stuff to work. I hope so too. I certainly do. So that's what's next.
That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much.
See y'all, guys.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Walt, for this amazing drawing of Thor. This is incredible. Wow. All right, that's all the time we have. Remember, if you have guests that you want to see, if you have any questions about the show, or if you just want to contact us with your own short film or short animation, send us an email at comicologytv@aol.com. Keep on watching. Next show, we'll actually show you what Walt drew.
It's not there.
Wow.